Hello, viewers, and welcome back to the Warfighter Archives. Today we are discussing the English longbowmen, and obviously there's been a lot of content made about this topic, and you might ask, well, what can you possibly cover that hasn't been discussed already? Well, I think a lot of what I'm going to cover here will surprise you. I've gone out of my way to present facts that are not commonly discussed, and some I haven't seen mentioned at all. And this is really mind-boggling to me, since a lot of these facts are absolutely central to a complete understanding of why the longbowmen were so effective. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So who do you think the longbowmen were? And Hollywood likes to portray the lightly armored peasant archer facing off against a plate-clad knight, and that's pretty much dead wrong. Longbowmen were actually drawn from a very diverse section of society, and in fact, many longbowmen who fought in France were members of the landed gentry, which is a social class just a short step below knights. Others were commoners or members of a lord's household, and the reason that longbowmen came from such diverse backgrounds was due to the archery laws, which had started as part of the Assize of Arms in 1252. This law required all able-bodied men to maintain and practice with the bow specifically for the defense of the realm, and that's important because it gives a distinctly military flavor to this archery practice. In addition, we have some evidence that training started at a young age. The Bishop Hugh Latimer reflected on his archery training as a boy, saying that he was, quote, given new bows as he grew into them, thereby implying that he began training at a very young age and had to get new bows as he got taller and taller. He also states that no man may shoot a bow unless he is raised into it, suggesting again that longbowmen were trained from an early age. Also, bear in mind that Latimer was a bishop, not a soldier. Those contracted into the army might well have had a higher level of proficiency and more training. But why would a wealthy landowner want to serve amongst the archers instead of serving as a man-at-arms? There's a few reasons here, but most of them revolve around pay as well as status within the unit. If a minor landowner went to fight as a man-at-arms, there was a substantial outlay for equipment. As we can see in this picture, a man-at-arms generally had a set of at least brigandine and often plate armor, as well as multiple weapons such as a sword, dagger, poleaxe, and lance. He also likely had at least two, maybe three horses. On the other hand, a longbowman only needed a brigandine, his bow, and a melee weapon. I give a pretty good breakdown of armor costs in my video on the French men-at-arms, so I won't go into that here, but suffice it to say that brigandine is much cheaper than plate armor. While a good quality bow was expensive, most Englishmen would already own this due to those archery laws, and also a mounted archer only brought one horse since they were using the horse solely for movement and not for combat. Second, archers needed expertise with fewer weapons. Imagine if I told you that you needed to qualify with a sword, lance, poleaxe, and dagger before I'd hire you. That sounds a bit daunting, I imagine. Now, on the other hand, what if I told you you only need to demonstrate proficiency with the bow? While the bow is difficult to master, remember that you've been training with it since your teenage years, so you're already pretty familiar with it and have a decent level of proficiency. This is probably a key reason that many members of the gentry preferred to fight as archers and indeed may only have qualified to fight as archers. Finally, there was also status. Amongst the archers, a member of the gentry was often a captain and at least had more social standing than the commoners. Amongst the men-at-arms, he'd be one of the lower-ranking members of the company. And you can think about this for yourself. Would you rather be the lowest-ranking man-at-arms, or would you rather be the captain of a band of archers? Remember that, as the captain, you'd likely be entitled to a share of your men's plunder, and I think you could start to see why being an archer appealed to so many members of the gentry. But weren't men-at-arms paid more? And the answer to that is yes, they were. Now, please forgive the math here, but I've created some graphics to help. Here we can see men-at-arms were paid 1 shilling per day, while mounted archers saw their pay fluctuate between 4 and 6 pence. Foot archers were paid less at 3 to 6 pence per day. The pay rates fluctuated based on the period, and it also seems that archers in the Royal Army were more likely to be paid 6 pence per day. This is demonstrated in contracts such as that issued to Sir Thomas Tunstall in 1415, whose mounted archers were paid at this rate. But what does this mean? Was this even a good wage? And to figure that out, let's look at some medieval contemporaries and unfortunately do a little bit more math. If we figure an archer might serve for around 120 days at a rate of 6 pence per day, he could make 60 shillings, which is equal to £3. Over a year, this would be £9, which is close to the 10 to 12 pounds that a minor knight would make from his estates. Also, bear in mind that a knight's income was partly in services rendered by his tenants, whereas an archer's pay was entirely in liquid, easy to spend coin. English soldiers also expected to supplement their wages with plunder and ransoms. While this wasn't guaranteed, there are plenty of instances where Englishmen took immense plunder from the French armies and villages, as well as many noble prisoners who were ransomed for substantial sums. This income could easily surpass the archer's wages, so the upshot of all this is that serving as a longbowman, especially a mounted longbowman, was a profitable venture. For those that couldn't afford the time or money to be a man-at-arms, serving as an archer was an incredibly attractive alternative. But now let's talk about the longbow itself, and if you do a quick search for English longbow, you'll find all sorts of articles and videos referring to it as a, quote, medieval machine gun that sweeps knights off the battlefield, and the fact is that most of these claims are pure hype with little basis in fact. First, let's address the fact that the longbow is not a machine gun, medieval or otherwise. The longbow was a weapon that required a great deal of strength to draw and fire. An excellent demonstration done by Todd's workshop shows that a modern trained archer could fire around 6 arrows per minute, but admitted that he would struggle to maintain this rate of fire for any substantial period of time. We also have Barnaby Rich's 1574 book, A Right Excellent and Pleasant Dialogue Between Mercury and an English Soldier, and in this book, Rich states that a longbowman should fire 8 arrows in the time it takes an arquebusier to fire 5 shots. Arquebusiers in the period were expected to fire around 2 shots per minute, maybe slightly faster, so it probably took about 2 minutes for a good arquebusier to fire 5 shots, and that would be pretty fast. Therefore, we could say that a longbowman was probably expected to fire around 3 or maybe 4 arrows per minute. This is also supported from battles like Crécy. English archers were issued 2 additional quivers for a total of around 70 to 80 arrows each, and we know from chroniclers such as Froissart that the English archers were still firing late into the battle when the French infantry started to engage. This suggests that they were firing at a slow, measured pace, both to conserve their strength and ammunition, as well as to allow them to take time to aim their shots. I've seen claims that the longbowmen fired at 10 arrows per minute, which I find a bit unbelievable. Remember, this is a 145-pound to 160-pound draw, one so strong that an archer had to bend rather than draw the bow in contemporary terminology. Even if they could sustain fire at this rate, wouldn't they have exhausted their arrows in 7 minutes of firing? And on the other hand, if they were firing at 4 arrows per minute, they'd have almost 20 minutes of shooting, as well as having the time to take aimed shots, and this just seems much more likely, especially given that the English knew they would likely be facing multiple waves of French attackers. Second, longbows did not sweep knights off the battlefield despite what others may say. While the English sustained great success against French armies, this is more due to the better organization of English armies as well as their battlefield preparation. As I mentioned in my video on the French men-at-arms, executing a heavy cavalry charge requires a largely open, flat field. The English often disrupted this by using battlefield fortifications and obstacles such as pits and sharpened stakes. I'll go over this much more in the next section where we discuss tactics. However, suffice to say that the English selected and prepared battlefields carefully and were also given a healthy assist by the poor discipline of the French men-at-arms. While the French did adapt by integrating more artillery, this never replaced knights. In fact, the French army that emerged victorious from the Hundred Years' War still placed a heavy emphasis on its heavy cavalry, such as the gendarmes. So instead of sweeping knights off the battlefield, what the longbow really did was force better coordination and increased professionalism within the French army. Heavy cavalry remained an integral part of this formation. The difference was that now they communicated and worked together with their artillery as opposed to charging forward on their own. So, if it wasn't the longbow winning battles on its own, then what was it? And the answer lies in where and how the English fought. So, let's ask ourselves what other factors were in the major English victories at Poitiers, Agincourt, and Crécy. If you look at these battles, you'll see two common factors: battlefield selection and preparation. First, the English selected battlefields that often had two key features. The first was elevation, which would benefit the archers and slightly slow the French charge. The second was a limited battlefield. What do I mean by that? Well, the English usually chose battlefields that were enclosed by woods, villages, rivers, or a combination of the above. This meant that they could fight with a smaller force and keep the enemy from bringing their numbers to bear, much like the Spartans did at Thermopylae. Second is battlefield preparation. At Cressy, we know that the English dug pits or holes in front of their battle line, and that these slowed the French knights. At Agincourt, the English used sharpened stakes and attempted to do the same at Vournoy. Why is this important? These are what professionals refer to as battlefield obstacles. They serve the same purpose as a modern minefield or tank trap in that they are used to slow the enemy and create a kill zone. As you can see in this image here, a kill zone is a pre-planned point where the enemy is stopped or slowed. In military terminology, we call this quote-unquote fixing the enemy, so that they can be killed by fires. In modern warfare, fires are often artillery that's been pre-plotted on that point, but longbowmen work in the medieval context. So the English longbowmen were not mowing down heavily armored knights in the charge. This picture, translating the modern diagram to medieval terminology, we could see how the French cavalry would become entangled here right in front of the English lines on sharpened stakes or pits. This puts them squarely in front of the longbowmen, who now benefit from shooting a much more stationary and easier to hit targets. They're also very condensed and clumped together. Now, also, you need to imagine the perspective of a French knight here. Your charge is suddenly interrupted, there's confusion, your comrades and their horses are pushing and jostling against you, commanders are trying to bellow orders, possibly contradictory ones. That in and of itself is unnerving and disorienting on the battlefield. Then, imagine in this confusion, suddenly there's a hail of thousands of arrows being unleashed onto you. Even if only 1 in 10 can penetrate armor or hit their target, that's hundreds of men screaming in pain and terror all around you, to say nothing of the horses. In this panic and confusion, what would you do? Would you retreat to regroup? Would you keep advancing? Take cover? Different people will have different answers, and this is what would cause the French chargers to lose their cohesion. Those men that did decide to advance the English men-at-arms would be disoriented, demoralized, and likely only in small groups that would be easily handled by the well-formed, fresh English. And it's here that we can see how the longbow became such a terrifying and devastating weapon. It wasn't about the armor penetration or the sheer casualties. It was about the disordering effect and psychological blow that masked close-range volleys dealt to troops who were already confused and shaken. Lastly, we need to discuss the armor of the longbowmen, and this is very important for truly understanding their battlefield role. There's a tendency in Hollywood, and even amongst some historians and reenactors, to portray longbowmen as lightly armored peasants bravely facing down the thundering knights. This is fantasy, and we have some good evidence that longbowmen were not only well armored, but also fought in melee combat, especially as the Hundred Years' War continued. We know from existing contracts from the Cressy campaign, as well as royal orders and the Wars of the Roses, that archers are often expected to report with helmets, like a kettle helmet or something similar. We also see skeletons from places such as Towton and France that show longbowmen wore brigandine or jack of plate. While chroniclers don't specifically mention brigandine, some, such as Froissart, refer to how well harnessed or armored the English army was. Also, in these contemporary paintings, we can see depictions of longbowmen with helmets and brigandine, as indicated by little dots on the armor which depict the rivets. Now, obviously, we do need to take medieval art with a grain of salt, because there is a degree of stylistic license. However, this is very consistent across a lot of different artwork from the period, and it also lines up with the archaeological evidence as well as the statements and the descriptions from chroniclers. But how does this tell us anything about their battlefield role? And first of all, we have to recognize that brigandine was quality armor, and especially early in the Hundred Years' War, many men-at-arms wore brigandine. This paints longbowmen in a much more versatile light. Instead of being one-dimensional peasant archers, the historical glass cannon, if you would, Longbowmen could fight as medium infantry in a pinch. Notably, they would have been much better equipped than a lot of the French levy infantry. And we see this mentioned directly in chronicles. At Agincourt and Verneuil, the charge of the archers into melee proved to be a decisive factor in the English victory. By the Wars of the Roses, we see many accounts of archers, quote, setting down their bows and taking up swords and axes to participate in melee combat. Whether this is because the tactic became more common or because it is better recorded is open to debate. Here, we do have to be a little careful. While Longbowmen was capable of fighting in melee, that was probably not their preferred role. From chroniclers such as Froissart, we see that they only engaged in the melee once it was a necessity or once their arrows were exhausted. However, it is clear that when they did charge, their capabilities in melee combat were sufficient to be a decisive factor in winning. This paints English armies as an elite, flexible force. You had men-at-arms who could fight as elite heavy infantry or elite heavy cavalry. They were combined with longbowmen who could fight as either elite archers or as medium infantry. This type of versatility is exactly what any military commander from any period in military history wants, and the term tactical flexibility is still a common buzz phrase in professional militaries around the world. There's a reason for this. Troops that are tactically flexible give the commander more options in battle. Moreover, the commander can deploy them in different locations. For example, if longbowmen really were lightly armored peasants who were virtually helpless in melee, it's highly unlikely that the English would have deployed them in the center of the battle line. This equation changes if the longbowmen are capable of holding their ground as medium infantry, much more durable and able to withstand dismounted and probably demoralized French men-at-arms. This becomes much more of a valuable tactic in this situation. In conclusion, I hope this video helps to reshape your perception of the longbowmen. One key lesson to take away is that a soldier is much more than just his weapon. He's a cog in a greater machine, and we always need to look at how his training, his equipment, and his tactics fit into that machine. When we understand this, we see that the longbowman was not just a peasant archer. He was a flexible soldier, certainly lethal as an archer, but also serviceable as a medium infantryman. He fought in an army that took advantage of these traits, pairing him with a steady battle line of men-at-arms and focusing on battlefield selection and preparation. I hope this deeper understanding sparks further curiosity and debate. After all, debate and questioning are two of the best ways to learn about history. Please don't forget to leave your thoughts, questions, and comments below, and until next time, take care.